Hello, Regulation Theory students. I'm back to you today on Lesson 3, Policy Instruments, in our course. And you'll recall that last lesson we talked quite a bit about the purpose of regulation to control harms in society. So we're going to pick that up now in terms of the types of policy instruments within government that can seek to address the types of harms that may also be applicable to regulation. But let's get into this subject now and look at the differences between the policy instruments and the differences of approaches to regulation itself. Okay, so let me open up here. Okay, so policy instrument options. I mean, any government, including the government of Canada, has policy instrument options that can be used to address priorities, to address harms, right? And under authorities of legislative acts. We'll talk about the relationship between policy instruments and legislative acts in a future lesson. But in the Canadian regulatory process, regulators have an obligation to consider all policy instruments to address a harm. They are not supposed to just jump automatically to a regulatory response, because other policy instruments may be able to achieve the harm reduction objective in a less intrusive manner, okay, or less costly manner to the regulated parties and to any third parties that are impacted by the regulation. Regulations are certainly one of the most heavily used policy instruments in governments because they work, which speaks to its importance. But that does not mean that regulation is always the first policy instrument that would be considered in every harm reduction exercise. Regulations tend to be more ideally suited to circumstances where the number of regulated parties is few and relatively homogeneous. The cause of the harm is relatively similar through various circumstances and in various settings, okay? Whereas other policy instruments may be more appropriate for diffuse circumstances, diffuse sources of harm, multiple points of harm causing activity, and so on, okay? For example, if we were regulating the emissions from cars that impact greenhouse gases, that contribute to greenhouse gases and climate change, typically we would be regulating the automobile manufacturers as opposed to each individual driver for obvious reasons, right? Reasons with respect to regulation design and with regulation implementation and enforcement. So there's a classic case where we would use regulation to encourage the automobile manufacturers to adopt certain standards, as opposed to adopting regulations, say, restricting the amount of time a person can drive their car, right? But we'll get into these scenarios in much greater detail as we go along, okay? But, just because regulation is something that the governments have familiarity with, institutional systems are set up to develop and implement regulations, we can't automatically jump to regulations by a federal government directive. We can't automatically assume that regulation is automatically the answer. All right, by cabinet directive on regulation, we need to look at other options. Okay. So, what is the scope of policy instruments? Policy instruments range from economic instruments, self-regulation, voluntary approaches, information and exhortation, public investment. These are things that are possible over and above or instead of regulation, okay? So, and we will be considering regulation separately at the end of this presentation, all right? So what are economic instruments? Well, it's pretty much the way they sound, right? Economic instruments create an economic incentive to influence the factors that are contributing to a harm. For example, I just gave you the example of the automobile. Why we would regulate the manufacturers, because there's relatively few of them. They have very similar forms of operation. They produce very similar products, and so on. So they're ideally suited to being approached with a regulatory instrument. But how would we approach the drivers of automobiles, right? Would we do that by regulation, or would we do that by economic instrument? Well, we would probably do that by economic instrument, because economic instruments are ideally suited to very diffuse populations in different circumstances, all in their own unique ways contributing to the problem or the harm, right? So in Canada, for example, instead of trying to regulate each individual consumer of an oil and gas product, we're trying to create economic incentives in the marketplace through a carbon tax, so that users of these products use them more sparingly, right? Or use them and so redirect their resources to other things rather than the tax on oil and gas. So we're encouraging people to be more cautious with the use of these products and these products that contribute to climate change. All right. Now, economic instruments can also include subsidies, but we're not getting into the question of subsidies very much now, although it may come up later as we go through the course. So economic instruments seek to impose costs, typically attempt to address market failures. In other words, people are not being charged adequate amounts for the costs they're passing on to the natural environment, to the ecosystem, to the atmosphere through the use of their automobiles. So the carbon tax tries to encourage more parsimonious use of those things that are contributing to a harm, right? So we're trying to change the price signals in the marketplace so that people maybe, instead of taking that extra drive or being more wasteful with the way they operate their automobile, maybe they're thinking twice, because there are costs now being applied to that. Okay, that they would not otherwise have had if the government didn't bring in an economic instrument on the question. But examples of economic instruments that impose costs are carbon taxes, say tradable permits, charges on wastewater and hazardous waste disposal, all trying to encourage fewer of these externalities, right? We're trying to encourage people to have less wastewater, to have less use of hazardous waste, to have less greenhouse gas emissions, and so we're trying to create an economic incentive where they internalize that into their decision making to avoid those costs where it is reasonable to avoid those costs. And that's the type of activity that the government is trying to encourage, right? We're trying to say, hey, maybe you should be doing a little less of this, okay? And in addition, we're going to show you why there's an economic incentive to do a little less, because we put a charge on this, and that charge can be avoided by simply doing less of what you're doing right now. All right, and then you can redirect those saved resources to some other value-added benefit that you have as an individual or a corporation or an organization. Okay, so businesses or individuals are presented with an incentive to internalize externalities and lower costs in the areas for which they are receiving these new charges. Okay, so use more renewable energy instead of oil and gas combustion. Use less water rather than more. Produce less toxic chemical waste as opposed to more, and so on. And the economic signals you're being given is, if I do those things, the government won't get me with that tax. I'll be able to lower my burden of that tax, okay? And then be more, if I'm a corporation, be more competitive relative to my competitors who are paying those charges at a higher rate than I am, and so on. So all of the calculations. And as individuals, maybe I can be a little bit more efficient with the way I use water, or I can be a little bit more efficient with the way I heat my house, or I can be more efficient with the way I drive my car. Do I really need to take my car to the 7-Eleven that's 2 blocks away? Basically what you're trying to do with economic instruments is to change the calculation about this activity that's contributing to a harm. Okay. Self-regulation is a kind of a special category of regulation. Self-regulation is typically used in cases of professional bodies such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and so on. Governments, through legislation, stipulate regulatory objectives and the rights and obligations of the self-regulating constituencies to achieve these objectives. So the government set out the objectives for the harm reduction or the harm prevention, but then it elects to allow these professional bodies to self-regulate themselves. Why do they do that? Because they can achieve the harm reduction objective without having to internalize all the capacity that you would need to regulate a highly professional body like doctors or like lawyers or like real estate agents or like accountants, who have a high degree of incentive to regulate themselves to a high standard, because if they don't, they're going to be in trouble with the public. In addition, they're going to be in trouble with criminal law or other types of legal infrastructure. So the government can save on its internal regulation costs. It can build relationships and understanding with professional communities by saying, okay, the government's saying, okay, this is what we expect of your professional community in terms of protecting the public from harms. Okay, but we recognize that your level of unique expertise in your field means that you're ideally suited to do your own self-regulation. I mean, subject to legislation that says this is what we expect as a government and this is how you're supposed to do it. But if you do it and you're consistent with that, then it's much more economical for us and for you if you self-regulate. Okay, so a lot of professional bodies self-regulate in that way. Does that mean it's forever? No. Self-regulation rights can be taken away. Recently in Canada, for example, when there was certain, if not illegal, certainly dubious activities taking place in the real estate industry in BC, the British Columbia government revoked the self-regulation capacities of the real estate community in British Columbia. So it does happen, all right? So ultimately, the power to control the harm still exists with government, but the implementation of the regulatory infrastructure is self-regulated. Okay, so that's a form of policy instrument that governments often use in professional bodies. Okay, voluntary approaches. Voluntary approaches are often called voluntary approaches because the industry takes it on themselves, but very rarely does an industry take on that kind of a voluntary obligation devoid of a government context within which it appears apparent to the industry that if they don't undertake voluntary actions, it's going to call for more government actions to address harms. Okay, so governments often encourage and foster voluntary approaches in industry as an alternative to direct regulation where that is feasible to address a harm adequately to satisfy the government's interest in protecting the people and society from harm. There are many different voluntary approaches operating in Canada and internationally across virtually all sectors of the economy. There are literally hundreds of them. Okay, examples include the big ones: responsible care in the chemical industry, Canadian Industry Partnership for Energy Conservation, Forest Stewardship Council for forestry and wood products, Global Reporting Initiative for in the UN context, International Standards Organization and the Canadian Standards Association, the Global Compact. I mean, there are many voluntary approaches, but all designed to anticipate the need for the industry to improve its representation of its responsibility to control harms that are getting the public and therefore governments upset. So the industry will devise a voluntary approach so that they have more control over the delivery of the harm reduction that they know is going to happen if they don't act on their own, right? Government will eventually be compelled by the public to step in, and industry sees it in their interest to adopt a voluntary approach prior to that happening, or adopting a voluntary approach in addition to already existing government regulatory action so that that regulatory action does not need to be extended. And to the extent that those voluntary approaches are effective, the government is supportive, because then the government doesn't have to develop the regulations and it doesn't have to bring about enforcement or implementation, compliance, promotion, and enforcement. All right, so the industry itself undertakes that. Why does the industry undertake that? Because now that they've invested so heavily in this voluntary approach, they also can't allow any of their membership to simply disregard those voluntary initiatives and bring the whole infrastructure into disrepute, then again calling the government to pay attention and potentially to regulate. All right, so there's a mutual interest there. Okay, now are voluntary approaches always as comprehensive and so on? Maybe not, right? But maybe they're adequately comprehensive enough that the government considers that the trade-off between action on government's behalf as opposed to letting the industry act, it's a good trade-off. We're not losing that much in harm reduction, but we're gaining a lot and not having to regulate the industry even more when, due to scarcity and opportunity costs, maybe we don't want to invest all of the resources we would need to do that, because we have other harm reduction objectives as a government. We have other things going on, tons of other things, and we only have so much money, right? So voluntary approaches, are almost always backed by a viable threat, formal or informal, of direct government action. All right, they're almost always there, or they're backed by consumer backlash. The industry is concerned that there will be a major consumer backlash if they don't clean up their act. All right, I mean, there's always the carrot of the voluntary approach, but let's face it, right? I mean, there's a stick there. There's always a stick. It might be in the closet, but it can be taken out at any time if the industry continues to create conditions where the government is brought under pressure to address a harm, or consumers start to introduce boycotts, or there's bad press, or all these kinds of things are motivators for voluntary action. Okay. Now, next one is information and exhortation, or what we often call suasion. And that's government acting in a way that says that, maybe a policy instrument that imposes a cost, like an economic instrument, or a policy instrument that regulates a problem, maybe this problem is not really all that amenable to both economic instruments and regulation, or the political costs of doing either will be high, and the nature of the harm is such that maybe we can address a major aspect of this harm by simply bringing greater awareness and education to the public. All right, so the government will launch significant public information campaigns. You'll see advertisements on TV about this, that, and the other thing about avoiding, keeping your children away from e-cigarettes, or explaining why a certain thing should be done in such and such a way, or about wearing masks during COVID-19, or would we regulate that? Would we try to regulate the public to wear masks? No, we would probably use public education and suasion, right, to do that. So there are lots of areas of harm where it makes more sense to publicly educate, make more aware, to persuade action. And so governments will often use that as a policy instrument to bring about change in areas that are of that nature. Like protecting your kids from e-cigarettes, or wearing a face mask to prevent spread of the contagion of COVID-19, or and there are many instances of this, anti-smoking campaigns, and so on, or the campaigns that were brought in before cannabis legalization about raising awareness on the limitations and the safety considerations with respect to cannabis. And it's also important to note that like voluntary approaches and like economic instruments, information and exhortation can be used in combination with other policy instruments. Okay, for example, we regulated the legalization of cannabis, but that came with a whole bunch of public education and suasion as well. All right, and we can have economic instruments that are backed by regulation. All right. There are different policy mixes. So if a harm is significant enough and is complex enough, there may be 2 or 3 policy instruments used to address that harm at any given time. Okay, so I want to get across the point that these are different policy instruments, but they're not used in complete separation from each other all the time. Okay, they can often be combined. For example, if you're about to bring in a new significant regulation addressing a significant area of harm, typically the government would also use suasion, various kinds, okay, to influence that. Or it may be combined with some kind of an economic instruments like fines, or some kind of permitting scheme that has charges associated with it. Any number of different mixes to address any number of different harms that have unique characteristics, that if we were going to prevent those harms and their causal factors, we need a mix here. It's not one simple regulation, right? It may be that we need a policy mix to achieve the ultimate harm reduction objective. Okay? Another major policy instrument, of course, is public investment, where the government invests in something. okay? It involves the state socializing the costs of addressing an important factor contributing to reducing a public harm or capitalizing on a potential public good, all right? Most commonly, public investment arises when a problem or opportunity cannot be addressed by any one entity or group in society due to the solution being uneconomical for them to undertake. So the government has to take it on for the collective. Okay. For example, every business and family within a jurisdiction has need for water purification, roads, education, waste disposal, but none are of a scale to establish these alone. So the government needs to establish them. All right. And so these are the types of things that go on, and we see this a lot in developing countries. Okay, when, for example, when industrial areas or industrial zones are set up or industrial parks are set up, the government would often make the land available so that the industries cluster in a given area. But because no one of those industries can afford to establish the water purification systems from all of the plants by themselves, because they are not of a scale to be able to afford such a thing, the government would move in and establish the water purification facilities for that industrial park. And then all of the users of the industrial park, or all the occupants of the industrial park who are using it for their wastewater, would pay a fee. All right. Same thing goes with water purification plants in Canadian cities. And when we first started off with solid waste disposal in Canada, some of the first solid waste disposal plants, our facilities in Canada, needed to be financed by government until it was evident that the regulations for solid waste collection and so on were as solidly established that a private investor had certainty that they could go in, make the investment, and would receive the waste and could make a reasonable profit. So that's the way it goes, where sometimes these public investments can be handed off to a private investor once the regulatory regime around this harm reduction is convincing enough that the private investor feels that, well, these regulations are clearly being rigorously applied, 90% of the people are adhering to it, therefore they need somewhere to put this waste. I can set up a private plant here, and with this government regulatory infrastructure reinforcing the delivery of the solid waste to my facility, I can make a profit. So I'm going to invest in that. All right. And, in other areas, that you're not going to have that happen. The street lights or urban water purification facilities and things like that. That's not going to happen in the same way. But, the important point is that there are stages in the development of a situation or an area where harm could occur, where the government needs to step in and make the initial public investment, because there's no other entity available to make that investment, because it doesn't make economic sense for them to do that, because they don't have the scale of activity to support that investment. Okay? Now, then we have regulation, right? Regulation. We can categorize regulation into three categories, which are the three that I use. You will find different descriptions of these in the industry, but based on some 30 years of experience, this is what works for me, all right? Three different types of regulations: technical regulations, performance-based regulations, and process and procedural regulations, okay? Technical regulations are often called traditional command and control regulations. They stipulate technologies or technical specifications that must be used in order to comply with a harm reduction objective, okay? This characteristic places relatively strict constraints on the regulated party to function exactly as prescribed. All right. So if you're a maker of baby cribs, okay, I'm going to come back to you, because of the central importance of the characteristic of the product once it hits the market. I'm going to come to you with technical regulations, and those technical regulations are probably going to say things like the railings in the baby crib must only be this far apart, because we don't want to get babies' heads caught in between the railings and they suffocate. Mattresses must be of a certain kind for baby cribs. The baby crib must be able to sustain a certain amount of weight and jostling and moving around when the baby's in it. All of those tests are technical regulations that would be applied to the specifics of that product, because the requirements of that product to be safe once it hits the market are of a technical nature. So they would be strictly prescribed technical regulations for that product. The same would go for electrical equipment, the wiring of a house, anything where there could be a very serious harm caused if a technical requirement was not met for that product. Okay, and then that goes to any of those products, like I say, electrical equipment, plumbing materials, how signal lights must work on cars, all these kinds of things. Anything to do with a product specification, where if the specification was not met, there could be significant harmful results, then technical regulations tend to apply. All right. And there are numerous technical regulations related to products. Okay, product design, that is. Now, the next form of regulation is called performance-based regulations, which are concerned with a result rather than how it is achieved. In other words, we're concerned with the performance of the entity relative to the harm reduction, rather than how they get there. Okay, and these are typically regulations that are applied where the circumstances are, for example, they're applied heavily in the area of the environment, for example, where our primary concern is not how they reduce harmful water emissions into the river that their plant is beside, but that they reduce them. Period. Okay, we don't care how you achieve it, just achieve it. All right. And the reason that governments in those kinds of circumstances, in industrial byproduct type circumstances, process and production method type circumstances, is because governments are primarily concerned with the end result. They're not trying to constrain the way the government has the best and most efficient way of meeting that goal. All right. So they're primarily concerned just with the goal. And why is that important to government? Because then government doesn't have to hire, reams and reams of technical experts who know the techniques, technology, manufacturing processes, and details of each industrial sector, which would be a humongously large environment department. It would be tens of thousands of people would be required to regulate the specifics of these processes. But rather, if all I'm measuring is the quality of the water that's coming out of the end pipe of a factory, I send a scientist to take a sample. It goes to a lab, and they say, are they under the limits for the emission of, say, heavy metals into the water stream, or a particular chemical runoff into the water stream, or whatever. And as long as they're meeting those thresholds, I'm good with that. Okay, because some companies will meet it will need to meet that standard in a costly way. Some companies may already be there, so they don't have to do anything, right? So why would I introduce detailed technology and technical specifications for that industry or for different industries when ultimately all I want to do is make sure that they achieve the performance standard? All right. And what's interesting is that in history, originally we started, most regulations were technical-based regulations, even for these kinds of things. But in the last 30 years, governments have moved more and more in these types of examples to performance-based regulations for the reasons that I've given. And what's even funnier is that, back in a long time ago, in the turn of the century, these types of regulations would not only be technical regulations, but they would be embodied in legislative instruments, legislative laws rather than regulations, which made them even more inflexible to change and even more inflexible for the industry to be able to adapt to the regulations. So naturally, we had lots of industry complaints about the rigidity, the inflexibility, the barriers to change and innovation that would come from a civil servant saying, you must use this piece of equipment. Well, you know what that does, right? It freezes history and time. So you would find industry still dealing with 30-year-old technology because the regulation says that you have to use that. So you've basically killed off any innovation, flexibility, modernization. So performance-based regulations want to avoid that, right? So performance-based regulations say, I don't care how you achieve it. As long as you're not transgressing any other regulation and you're meeting my performance-based objectives, which are to address a harm, I'm good with it. Okay? And then the only thing we have to do is we have to test them to make sure they're meeting the objective. We don't have to go through their plant. I don't have to hire a special team of engineers that know how these guys produce widgets. I just need to know that when they're producing widgets, they're not sending nasty stuff into the water stream or into the air or into the land. And then I can hire biologists and scientists and chemists to test that, right? And they're the same guys I can use for all kinds of different regulations. So it's much more efficient for the government, okay? So the historical trend in regulation has been to move towards performance-based regulations where possible in these kinds of circumstances. Okay, for the baby crib example, performance-based won't cut it, right? We don't count how many babies smothered. If you smother less than 10 babies, you're good. No, we don't say that, right? We say we don't want any babies smothered, so therefore the railings must be this, okay? So their technical regulations apply in that case, but when we're looking at air emissions or water emissions or these kinds of things, we might be able to apply a performance-based regulation, and when we can, we typically want to. Okay, so relative to technical regulations, performance-based regulations are better at enabling technological innovation, fostering economic efficiency and compliance, and enhancing implementation efficiency of the regulator. Okay, these regulations do not prevent a regulated entity from selecting available technology options on the market or developing new technology entirely to comply with the regulatory performance requirements, and that's what we want to encourage. If you're an environment person, you want to improve these things, you want to encourage this kind of innovation because maybe the innovation gets to the point that the emission we're worried about, they don't even use it in their production process anymore. They've completely eliminated. What could be a better outcome than that, right? Secondly, this type of regulation enables the regulated entity to pursue the most economical solution available to it for compliance. Not every industry you regulate is going to be at the same stage of readiness to respond to the regulation. Some, like I say, will already be there. Some will have a long way to go. But why would we treat them all the same? The only thing we want to treat the same about them is that they're all complying with the emission regulation. Okay? Because economic rationality dictates that cost effectiveness in regulations should be an important issue consistent with achieving the regulatory objectives. Scarcity and opportunity cost. Don't forget those things. Thirdly, the regulator need only be concerned with assessing results and not how they were achieved. This dramatically lessens the resources and internal capacity requirements of the regulator. Instead of having staff the regulator with experts in the technologies and techniques of dozens of business sectors, the regulator need be concerned primarily with the expertise to measure the performance of stipulated by a regulation, e.g. measuring emissions from an industrial plant, whether it be water, air, land, hazardous waste, volumes of hazardous waste, whatever, okay? So that's why that's why a lot of those types of regulations over time have moved to performance-based regulation, albeit there are still a lot of technical regulations that tend to apply to characteristics of a product rather than characteristics of a process, okay, which is performance-based. Process or procedural regulation, as the name implies, stipulates processes and procedures that must be followed as prescribed in law and regulation. This form of regulation influences the lives of all citizens to one degree or another, when we often don't even know it, because we often think that, oh, this is the way we do it, I guess, okay? So you're a foreign student, an international student, you arrive in Canada, and you're complying with all kinds of procedural regulations. You don't even know it. You just assume that this is the way they do it here. Okay, this is, when I got the pamphlet, they said to do it this way. Okay, great, we'll do it that way. And but that's often, somewhere that's embedded as a process and procedural regulation. Procedural regulations can range from the basics, such as industry reporting requirements and management systems, to issues that are fundamental to government and legal decision processes. Like a process and procedural regulation is in criminal law. If you get arrested, there are certain processes and procedures that the arresting officers must allow you, in terms of reading you your rights and everything, to go before you go to the court. Right? There's certain very strict rules. Courts of law are run by process and procedural regulations. Courts operate this way because it's mandated that they operate this way. When you apply for any kind of government funding, for unemployment insurance, or for the CERB during COVID-19, or you're applying to a public university. All of these things are stipulated in process and procedural regulations. So that this is the way it works for everybody. All right. And, when people break those rules, they break the law. You might have heard the famous case down in the U.S. where people were bribing admissions officers at the top universities to allow their children to get into the university with not complying with all the process and procedural requirements. They were charged under criminal law, okay? And some of them have been prosecuted and found guilty, okay? So process and procedural regulations are... And for example, an environmental regulator can sort of, before they want to, they're sure about how to approach an area of harm, they might release a process and procedural regulation that just simply says that by such and such a date, all of these industries in these sectors must report to the government on the amount of said chemical that they use, or the amount of hazardous waste of this type that they produce, or whatever the government is interested in, okay? So process and procedural regulations are all over the place. And the uniqueness of these regulations is often they just become, the way of doing things. Oh, this is the way we do things. Well, actually, there are a number of different ways we could be doing this, but we're doing it this way because it's stipulated somewhere in a process and procedural regulation. And for instance, the procedures for how new legislative acts and regulations in government must be developed are forms of procedural regulations. Okay, due process and parliamentary rules of conduct are process and procedural regulations. Due process requirements for application of the law, the conduct of the courts, immigration boards, etc., all apply in this case. The procedures that must be followed for pre-market approvals of new pharmaceuticals, agrochemicals, industrial chemicals are a further example, along with any number of other licensing and permitting activities of government. Okay, so process and procedural regulations are numerous and they're everywhere. But the unique aspect of those is, like I say, often we're kind of saying, this is the way we do things, I guess. When in Rome, right? We do it this way. But there's a lot to them in the background, okay? Now, there's another thing I want to talk to you about today is the distinction between regulations and standards, because, regulatory affairs students, when they first get started, often confuse the two, all right? It's important to understand this distinction because it's an important distinction, okay? A standard is a document that outlines how a product should be made or performed, or a process or practice should be conducted. Generally, standards are voluntary instruments, unless embedded into regulations that have legal force or referenced by regulations that have legal force. In other words, an ISO standard is not a law in Canada. A CSA standard is not a law in Canada. It's a voluntary standard. Now, industries may have all kinds of other reasons to adhere to that standard, almost like it's a law, because the public consumer demanded, that it's necessary to be able to have coordination with my suppliers of inputs into my product manufacturing process, any number of other reasons. But it's important to understand that standards on their own are not regulations. They're not law unless they are referenced to be by a regulation to have the authority of law, okay? So standards, whether domestic or earnest, to help to reassure consumers that products, systems, and organizations are safe and reliable. Draw on industry expertise and experience when developing regulations applicable to an available standard. And later on, I'll give you a little bit more on how sort of the ISO process works and so on. But in Canada, for example, the Standards Council of Canada coordinates standardization in Canada. It's ultimately responsible for improving standards. But they do not develop standards themselves, okay? Standards development organizations are accredited by the SAC to develop standards in Canada, working with industry and with government representation when the government has a keen interest in it. But still, the standard that gets produced is a voluntary standard, all right? Now, again, the industry will often have numerous incentives to adhere to the standard, okay, because consumers expect it and so on. But strictly speaking, it is not a legal instrument. It's not an instrument required by law, okay? For example, the Canadian Standards Association is accredited by the SAC as a standards development organization and a certification organization. What is a certification organization? A certification organization has expertise in the methodologies for providing assurances that the control systems conform to the standard requirements. They do continuous online inspection, auditing of quality assurance system, and examination of finished products are all part of certification organizations. On this slide, you can find the directories in Canada of these various organizations. Why is that important? Because some of them may be good employment prospects as well. Okay. And the Standards Council of Canada also represents Canada's interest in the development of international standards. All right. The SCC is a member of two organizations that develop international non-governmental standards. International Organization for Standardization, the ISO, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and the International Electrochemical Commission. The adoption of international standards helps to ensure that national regulations for imports and exports are similar the world over. Okay? Because standards, while they're not legal, when a highly technical standard is developed with expertise drawn from industry, other governments everywhere, when it comes back to Canada, the government officials are going to look at it and say, well, you mean these guys, they know what their stuff is. Okay, so I mean, I'm assuming that this is the way their industry is going to operate. Unless I have a problem with it, I'm just going to let the standard operate. All right? But in some cases, the government is so determined that a harm be reduced or a harm be adjusted, and the standard it can significantly contribute to that. The government may develop a regulation with various aspects to it, including one aspect being that to be in compliance with this regulation, you must adopt and adhere to standard X. Okay? And then the standard has legal dimensions. Okay? So that's important to understand the distinction between regulations and standards, in addition to the distinctions between regulations and other policy instruments. All right? Okay, on that score, I'll conclude, and I'll see you again next time for Lesson 4. Okay, gang? Take care for now. Bye-bye now.